What really happened to German women when Soviet soldiers entered Berlin in 1945? In the final weeks of World War II, as the Red Army encircled Germany's capital in a ring of fire and steel, hundreds of thousands of women and girls trapped inside the city faced something that historians have spent decades struggling to document, quantify, and properly reckon with. It is one of the darkest, most suppressed chapters of the entire war, a chapter that remained largely buried under political silence for nearly half a century. The women who survived it often carried their trauma to the grave, forbidden by shame, social stigma, and the deliberate policies of both West German and Soviet authorities from speaking openly about what they endured. But the truth, as it always does, eventually emerged. In this video, we will pull back the curtain on what really happened to German women in Berlin in 1945, drawing on diary entries, survivor testimonies, declassified Soviet records, and the work of historians who have dedicated careers to excavating this hidden story. So, without further ado, let us begin. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was dying. Germany's cities lay in ruins beneath Allied bombing campaigns that had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and reduced great urban centres to rubble. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared fighting force in Europe, had been ground down on two fronts. In the east, the Red Army had fought its way across the frozen steppes of Russia, through the blood-soaked battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, through the devastated cities of Ukraine and Poland, and was now massing on the Oder River, barely 60 miles from Berlin. In the west, Allied forces were crossing the Rhine. Germany was caught in a closing vice, and everyone inside the country knew it, even if they dared not say so out loud. Berlin, in early 1945, was a city simultaneously in denial and in terror. Adolf Hitler, ensconced in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, continued issuing orders to armies that barely existed, planning counteroffensives with units that had been shattered, dreaming of relief columns that would never arrive. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels worked ceaselessly to convince the German public that final victory was still within reach, that secret weapons would turn the tide, that the Allied coalition would fracture before the Wehrmacht did. But ordinary Berliners were not fooled. They could hear the distant rumble of artillery growing closer day by day. They could see the endless columns of exhausted, hollow-eyed refugees streaming in from the east, people who had fled ahead of the Soviet advance, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the horror in their eyes. The stories those refugees brought with them were terrifying. They spoke of burning villages, of massacred civilians, of women and girls dragged from their homes. German propaganda had for years painted the Soviet enemy as subhuman Asiatic barbarians, and now those same refugees seemed to be confirming the propaganda's darkest warnings. The irony was devastating and complete. The Nazi regime that had itself committed crimes of almost incomprehensible savagery against the peoples of Eastern Europe, that had murdered millions of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, that had conducted a war of deliberate extermination against the Jewish people, was now reaping a terrible harvest. The Wehrmacht had swept into the Soviet Union in 1941 with orders to treat the population as racially inferior and militarily expendable. Whole villages had been burned. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been allowed to starve in German captivity. The Einsatzgruppen death squads had followed the advancing armies and murdered civilians by the hundreds of thousands. Now, 4 years later, the Red Army was coming back, and it carried those years of atrocity and grief and fury with it. Understanding what happened in Berlin in the spring of 1945 requires grappling with this history. The scale of Soviet violence against German women did not occur in a vacuum. It was shaped by 4 years of total war, by Nazi propaganda that had dehumanized the Soviet population, by Soviet propaganda that responded in kind, by alcohol, by the collapse of military discipline that attends any massive offensive operation, by the deliberate cultivation of rage among some Soviet commanders, and by the simple, brutal mechanics of conquest. None of this is to say that the violence was inevitable or justified. It was not. It was criminal. But it cannot be understood, let alone prevented from recurring, without examining its full context. And so we will examine it carefully and honestly, because these women and their suffering deserve nothing less than the full, unvarnished truth. The Battle of Berlin officially began on April 16, 1945, when Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched the Great Offensive at the Silo Heights on the Uda River, firing a barrage from more than 40,000 artillery pieces that witnesses said turned night into day and could be heard as far away as Sweden. The barrage lasted for 35 minutes. When the guns fell silent and the Soviet infantry began its advance, German defenders at the heights fought with a ferocity born of desperation. The battle for the heights lasted 3 days and cost the Red Army nearly 100,000 casualties. But Zhukov's forces broke through, and so did the army of Marshal Ivan Konev, attacking from the south. Within days, the two Soviet army groups were sweeping around Berlin from north and south, enveloping it in a vast pincer movement that would close on April 25, 1945, completely encircling the German capital with over 1.5 million Soviet troops. Inside Berlin, roughly 2 million civilians remained. The city's population had once been 4 million, but bombing raids and the evacuation of children had thinned it considerably. Of those who remained, the overwhelming majority were women. The men had been called up into the Wehrmacht, or the Volkssturm, the desperate last-ditch militia of old men and boys that Hitler had ordered formed in the final months of the war. Berlin's streets, apartments, cellars and air raid shelters were filled with women of all ages, from elderly grandmothers in their 80s to teenage girls barely old enough to understand what was coming. They had heard the stories from the East. Many had begun preparing in the only way they could, by hiding in basements, by covering windows with blackout curtains, by smearing their faces with dirt and charcoal to make themselves look old and sick and unappealing, by stockpiling whatever food they could find, and by steeling themselves for the worst. The worst came with terrifying speed. Soviet forces began entering the outer districts of Berlin in the last days of April 1945. As they did, the pattern of violence that had been documented across East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, and the other eastern territories immediately reasserted itself. The question historians have wrestled with for decades is how widespread it was, and the answer, drawn from sources on every side, is deeply disturbing. The most careful scholarly estimates, based on hospital records, post-war surveys, and the work of historians, including Anthony Beaver, Barbara Jaw, and Helke Sander, suggest that somewhere between 90,000 and 130,000 women in Berlin alone were raped during the battle and its immediate aftermath. Across the whole of Germany east of the Elbe, including the formerly German territories of East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, the estimates range from 1 to 2 million women. These are not small numbers. These are numbers that describe a catastrophe. How did it begin? In many cases, the first Soviet soldiers to enter a building or a neighborhood were not the worst offenders. Frontline combat troops, in the middle of fighting for their lives, often passed through quickly. It was in the days and nights that followed when units paused, when the fighting moved on, when soldiers found wine cellars and vodka stockpiles, that the violence escalated most sharply. Berlin, like every major European city, was full of wine cellars, apartment building storage rooms with locked racks of pre-war vintages, restaurant basements with beer and spirits, and warehouses stocked with spirits that had been intended for the German war effort. Soviet soldiers drank heavily. By the evening of the first day that Soviet forces occupied a particular neighborhood, many of them were profoundly intoxicated, and the combination of alcohol, combat stress, years of accumulated anger, and a complete collapse of normal social restraints produced something terrible. Women who survived those nights described the same basic pattern over and over again in diaries, in interviews conducted decades later, and in testimony collected by German hospitals and public health officials in the weeks that followed. Soldiers would enter a building sometimes alone, sometimes in groups of 2 or 3, sometimes in larger groups. They would move from apartment to apartment or from cellar to cellar. They would demand watches, food, and alcohol. Common patterns of looting that occurred everywhere, and then, very often, they would find a woman or girl and assault her. Women who resisted were sometimes shot. Women who called out or screamed were sometimes beaten savagely. In the most harrowing accounts, soldiers would work through an entire apartment building systematically, one floor at a time, over the course of a night, leaving almost no one untouched. The ages of the victims ranged with a cruelty that defies easy description. Hospital records from the weeks after Berlin's fall document victims ranging from girls as young as 8 years old to women in their 80s. The elderly were not spared. Women who were visibly pregnant were not spared. Women who were clearly ill were not spared. Women who spoke Russian and tried to communicate, who showed photographs of Soviet friends or relatives, who displayed Communist Party membership cards from the pre-war Weimar era, were frequently not spared either. What drove some soldiers to pause and others to continue, what the particular calculation was in any given moment, seems to have depended on individual character, on the unit they served in, on the level of intoxication, and sometimes simply on luck. One of the most extraordinary documents to emerge from this period is the diary known in English as A Woman in Berlin, published anonymously in 1954 and later attributed to Martha Hillers, a German journalist who had been born in 1911. Hillers was 34 years old when the battle began, a well-educated, widely travelled cosmopolitan woman who had lived through the Weimar Republic, witnessed the rise of National Socialism with skepticism, and found herself trapped in Berlin as the Soviet forces closed in. Her diary, written on scraps of paper in the chaos of the spring of 1945, is one of the most remarkable personal documents of the 20th century. It is raw, intelligent, darkly ironic, and utterly unflinching in its account of what she experienced and witnessed. It is also a document that caused enormous controversy when it was first published, because German society in the 1950s was not ready to hear it. Hillers did not write as a passive victim. She wrote as a survivor, a woman who made calculating decisions about how to navigate an impossible situation, and who documented her reasoning with the detachment of a journalist, even as she recorded experiences of profound personal violation. She described the first night of Soviet occupation in her building, the soldiers moving through the cellars, the sounds from nearby apartments, her own experiences. And then, in a passage that shocked readers and has been quoted by historians ever since, she described the decision she came to within days of the occupation beginning. If assault was going to occur regardless, she reasoned, then it was better to find one senior officer whose protection might shield her from the random violence zoo of multiple perpetrators. She set about doing exactly that. She found first a Soviet lieutenant and then eventually a major, officers whose rank gave them some authority over the enlisted men, and who, in exchange for her company, provided a degree of shelter from the worst of the random violence. Was this collaboration? Was this coercion? Was this survival? Hillers herself wrestled with these questions in her diary, writing with a lucidity that is almost painful to read. She was under no illusion about the nature of what she was doing, but she was equally clear about the alternative, which was to have no protection at all. She described the conversations among women in the building's cellar, women ranging in age from teenagers to grandmothers, women from different class backgrounds, different political histories, different temperaments, all of them arriving at the same terrible arithmetic. The question was not whether something bad was going to happen. The question was whether it would happen many times, randomly, violently, at the hands of multiple perpetrators, or whether a strategic accommodation might make it more survivable. Many women in Berlin made similar calculations. They were not collaborators in any morally clean sense of the word. They were survivors making decisions under conditions of extreme coercion, and to judge them by any other standard is to fundamentally misunderstand what they endured. The Soviet authorities' response to the violence was inconsistent at best and indifferent at worst. It would be incorrect to say that Soviet command did nothing. Some commanders did issue orders against what was officially termed looting and marauding, a euphemism that sometimes encompassed rape. Some individual political officers intervened to stop specific incidents when they personally witnessed them. A small number of Soviet soldiers were disciplined and at least some were executed for crimes against German civilians. But the overall response was wholly inadequate to the scale of what was happening, and in some cases the attitude of the high command was worse than inadequate. When the Soviet writer and war correspondent Vasily Grossman raised concerns about the violence and suggested it should be stopped, he was told, in essence, that men who had fought for 4 years through unimaginable suffering had certain things coming to them. This attitude was not universal among Soviet commanders, but it was sufficiently widespread to constitute a policy of de facto tolerance. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the commander of the forces that took Berlin, was a military genius of the First Order, one of the greatest commanders of the 20th century. His record in the war against Nazi Germany was extraordinary, and without his contributions the defeat of Nazism would have been far more difficult and costly. But Zhukov was also a man who had witnessed the German army's conduct in the Soviet Union, who had seen destroyed cities and murdered civilians and the skeletal survivors of German prisoner of war camps, and who did not view what his soldiers were doing in Germany with anything approaching the moral urgency that the situation demanded. The Red Army's general orders after Berlin's fall included provisions against what were termed anti-Soviet acts and excesses against the civilian population. But enforcement was sporadic, and the penalties actually applied bore no relationship to the scale of what was occurring. Stalin's own response is instructive. When the Yugoslav communist leader Milovan Djilas raised the issue of Soviet soldiers' conduct in Yugoslavia with Stalin, Stalin reportedly replied, "And cannot understand it. If a soldier who has crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire and death has fun with a woman, or takes some trifle." The comment has been reported in various forms by various sources, and its precise wording is debated by historians. But the attitude it expresses, a dismissiveness, a sense that male soldiers' violations of women were a trivial matter compared to the grand sweep of the war, a certain tolerance for what might be framed as the inevitable conduct of victorious armies, was characteristic of the era and of the specific Soviet command culture of 1945. It did not mean that every Soviet commander condoned the violence. Many did not. But it established a climate in which accountability was not seriously pursued. Soviet propaganda had, throughout the war, played a complex and in some ways contradictory role in relation to violence against German civilians. On one hand, the official ideology of the Soviet Union was internationalist, and official propaganda emphasized that the enemy was fascism rather than the German people as a whole. The famous Soviet poet and propagandist Ilya Ehrenburg had written during the war in terms that were far more visceral and personal, urging Soviet soldiers to kill the Germans, writing with a rage and a specificity that went well beyond official ideology, and that many historians believe contributed to a culture in which atrocities against German civilians were viewed as legitimate or at least understandable. Some Soviet commanders explicitly distanced themselves from Ehrenburg's rhetoric and from the violence it encouraged. Others did not. The question of what was going through the minds of the individual soldiers who committed these acts is one that historians approach with some caution, partly because the perpetrators left almost no direct testimony, and partly because the exercise of understanding is easily confused with the exercise of excusing. What can be said, carefully, is that the Red Army in 1945 was composed of men who had endured and who had watched their comrades and their families endure, suffering on a scale almost impossible for anyone who did not live through it to grasp. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people in the war, military and civilian combined. That is roughly 1 in 7 of the entire pre-war Soviet population. Whole villages had been destroyed. Cities like Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Kiev had been devastated. Soviet soldiers advancing into Germany in 1945 frequently passed through German towns and cities that were, by comparison with the Soviet territories they had fought through, almost intact. Many soldiers were consumed by a bitterness that expressed itself in looting, destruction, and violence. A fury at the apparent prosperity and normality of Germany compared to the smoking ruins of everything they had left behind. None of this explains away what happened. Explanation is not justification, but it is history, and history must be confronted if it is to be learned from. The women of Berlin were not responsible for the German army's conduct in the Soviet Union. The great majority of them were not soldiers, not party members, not war criminals. Many were simply ordinary women who had tried to survive under a regime they had not chosen and who were now trapped between the dying fury of that regime and the arriving fury of those who had come to destroy it. They deserved protection. They did not receive it. And the silence that descended over their experiences in the decades that followed constituted a second, quieter, but still significant injustice. What did it feel like to be a woman in Berlin in those weeks? The testimony that exists is fragmentary and often harrowing to read. Marta Hillers wrote in her diary about the particular horror of the nights when darkness provided cover for the soldiers moving through the buildings. She wrote about women in the cellar lying awake listening for footsteps on the stairs, about the sounds that told them what was happening in the apartments above, about the strange, dissociated calm that some women developed as a psychological defense mechanism, a kind of willed numbness that allowed them to function. She wrote about a 14-year-old girl in the building who was assaulted and who afterwards sat in the cellar staring at nothing, unreachable for days. She wrote about the elderly woman who lived on the third floor and who emerged from her apartment the morning after the Soviets arrived with a face that told the building's other residents everything they needed to know without a word being spoken. The hospitals of Berlin were overwhelmed. German medical staff, themselves operating under conditions of extreme deprivation, with dwindling supplies and bombed-out facilities, found themselves confronted almost immediately with enormous numbers of women who had been assaulted and who were suffering from a range of physical injuries. The paperwork from this period, much of it surviving in German archives, is among the most important documentary evidence of the scale of what occurred. Reports from various Berlin hospitals in May and June 1945 document thousands of cases. The Charity Hospital, Berlin's great teaching hospital, recorded case after case. The city's network of women's clinics saw numbers that their staff had no precedent for. Doctors who had survived the bombing and the battle and who thought they had seen everything were confronted with something they had not seen before and would not forget. Among the most urgent medical concerns in the weeks and months following Berlin's fall was the question of pregnancy. It has been estimated that somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 children in Berlin were conceived as a result of rape in the weeks of Soviet occupation. The actual number is impossible to determine precisely, partly because the German authorities who might have recorded it were not functioning in any normal sense in May 1945, and partly because women themselves had strong reasons to avoid official documentation. What is known is that there was an immediate and massive demand for abortions, and that German doctors, under circumstances of enormous practical and moral complexity, performed them in very large numbers. In post-war Germany, abortion was technically illegal under statutes inherited from the pre-war period. But the conditions of 1945 were so far removed from normal peacetime circumstances that many doctors simply set the law aside. Some estimates suggest that between 80 and 90% of the pregnancies that resulted from the Soviet occupation of Berlin were terminated. The women who chose to continue their pregnancies faced additional layers of suffering. Many were shunned by their families or their communities. Some were told by their own husbands, returning from prisoner of war camps or from Wehrmacht service, that they could not accept the child or that the marriage was over. The children themselves, who bore no responsibility for the circumstances of their conception, grew up carrying a burden of stigma and silence. Many were never told the truth of their origin. Some discovered it accidentally, through overheard conversations or documents found after their mothers' deaths. Others pieced the truth together from the evidence of their own faces, from ethnic features that did not match those of the men who raised them, from family photographs and dates that did not add up, from the way their mothers flinched away from certain questions and certain memories. The silence that German society imposed on this history was, in many ways, as damaging in its own fashion as the violence itself. When Martha Hillers published her diary anonymously in 1954, first in English, then in German, the reaction in Germany was largely hostile. She was accused of defaming German women, of making them appear complicit in their own violation, of somehow serving Soviet propaganda by documenting what Soviet soldiers had done. The German publisher, who had intended to bring out a German edition, withdrew from the project under the pressure of these objections. The book did not appear in German until 2003, nearly 50 years after its first publication, shortly before Hiller's own death. She had requested that her identity remain concealed during her lifetime, a request that was respected, and she died in 2001 without ever publicly acknowledging her authorship. The reasons for this silence were complex and layered. In East Germany, the subject was essentially forbidden. The Soviet Union was the founding patron and ideological guardian of the German Democratic Republic, and the East German authorities had absolutely no interest in any historical narrative that might damage the reputation of the Red Army or complicate the official story of Germany's liberation from fascism. In East Germany, the Soviet soldiers were heroes and liberators, full stop. Any deviation from this narrative was politically dangerous. Women who had been assaulted in 1945 lived for decades in a state where the perpetrator's nation was the ruling power, where Soviet military memorials dominated public spaces, where the rhetoric of Soviet-German friendship was omnipresent. Speaking out was not simply socially difficult, it could be politically dangerous. In West Germany, the reasons for silence were different but equally powerful. The dominant political culture of the 1950s and early 1960s was oriented toward reconstruction, toward rebuilding, toward normalization. The Federal Republic was establishing itself as a democratic state, building alliances with the Western powers, joining NATO, developing the economic miracle that would transform it into one of the world's leading economies. In this context, dwelling on the sufferings of German women at the hands of Soviet soldiers created difficulties on multiple levels. It risked seeming like a deflection from German guilt, a way of saying that Germany too had suffered and therefore the crimes of the Nazi regime should be viewed in some kind of moral equivalence with what the Red Army had done. It risked reopening wounds that the country was trying desperately to close, and it risked confronting German men, many of whom had returned from the war, to find that their wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters had survived things they were not prepared to hear about or to process with any kind of emotional maturity. The returnees themselves were a problem that German society barely acknowledged. Men who came home from the war, from prisoner of war camps in France and Britain and the Soviet Union, from the ruins of the Wehrmacht, encountered women who had changed in ways they did not understand and could not accept. Women who had survived Berlin in 1945 had, in many cases, developed a self-sufficiency, a pragmatism, a certain hardness that was the direct product of what they had endured. They had managed on their own. They had made impossible decisions under impossible pressure. They had survived. Many of them found that the men who returned expected to resume authority over households that had, by necessity, been run exclusively by women for years, and that those men had no emotional vocabulary for what their wives and daughters had experienced. The result was often silence, a wall of unspoken experience that stood between the women who had been there and the men who had not. There are accounts, documented in post-war psychological studies and in the testimony of social workers and doctors who worked in Berlin in the late 1940s, of marriages that collapsed not because the returning husband knew what had happened, but because the wife could not find a way to speak of it, and the husband could not find a way to ask. There are accounts of women who told their husbands exactly what had occurred and who were immediately abandoned. There are accounts of women who told their husbands and were met with a mixture of guilt, rage directed at the wrong target, and a grief that the couple eventually worked through together. And there are accounts, perhaps the largest category of all, of women who told no one, ever, and who carried everything alone until they died. Marta Hillers wrote in her diary with characteristic precision, "What happens to us collectively, which somehow dilutes it. What we're going through is a mass experience, a historical experience, one that will be studied." She was right. It has been studied, though it took far longer than she might have hoped. The historians who eventually tackled the subject with proper scholarly rigour faced enormous methodological challenges. The documentary record was fragmentary. Survivors were elderly. Archives were scattered between countries with very different political interests. Soviet records on the subject were classified and inaccessible for decades. German police and hospital records from 1945 had often been destroyed in the war or in the chaotic period immediately after it. What emerged over the course of the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s was a picture assembled painstakingly from hundreds of sources, none of them complete on its own, all of them partial and contingent. The work of historians like Anthony Beevor, whose 2002 book Berlin the Downfall 1945 brought the subject to a wide English-language audience, and of German scholars like Barbara Johr and Helke Sander, whose 1992 study Befreier und Befreite, Liberators and Liberated, was one of the first serious academic treatments of the subject, gradually built a picture that was impossible to dismiss. The Russian government's initial response to Beevor's book, when it was translated into Russian, was to ban it, an act of censorship that told its own story about how much discomfort the subject continued to generate. The argument made in some Russian political and cultural circles was that the documentation of Soviet soldiers' conduct in 1945 was anti-Russian propaganda, a Cold War or post-Cold War attempt to undermine Russia's honour and its narrative of heroic sacrifice in the Great Patriotic War. These arguments, while understandable from a political standpoint, were historically untenable. The evidence was simply too abundant and too consistent to be explained away. Now let us turn to the specific geography and chronology of the violence, because understanding how it unfolded across Berlin's many distinct districts tells us something important about the factors that shaped it. Berlin was not a uniform experience. The Soviet offensive swept in from the east and south, and different districts fell at different times and to different units. The eastern districts of Lichtenberg, Treptow, and Köpenick fell first in late April. The central districts, including Mitte, Prenzlauer Berg, and Friedrichshain, fell in the first days of May in the most intense phase of the urban fighting. The western districts were largely not contested in the same way, and some areas in the British and American zones of occupation that were briefly entered by Soviet forces before the formal zonal boundaries were established also had experiences that differed from those of the eastern and central parts of the city. The Zehlendorf district in the southwest, which fell briefly to Soviet forces before being handed over to the Americans in July 1945, produced one of the most striking sets of comparative data. Women in Zehlendorf described experiences that, while still harrowing, were somewhat less severe on average than those reported by women in the eastern districts. Historians have attributed this difference to several factors. The Soviet units that first entered the western districts were often more disciplined than the assault units that fought through the east. The fighting had wound down, and some of the frenzy of combat had dissipated, and there was more awareness among Soviet commanders in those areas that they were entering territory that would soon be turned over to Allied control and that their conduct would be observed and reported. In the eastern districts, the situation was often far worse. Prenzlauer Berg, a densely populated working-class district north of the city centre, was the scene of some of the most intense and widespread violence. Women from this district, interviewed decades later by researchers working for documentary films and academic studies, described nights of particular horror during the first week of May 1945. One woman, who was 22 years old at the time and who spoke to researchers in the 1990s, described hiding in the cellar of her apartment building with approximately 30 other women, ranging from a girl of 12 to an old woman of 75. Soviet soldiers found the cellar on the second night. By morning, very few of the women in that cellar had been spared. The 12-year-old girl had been concealed beneath a pile of mattresses and blankets by the other women, who had collectively, silently, without any spoken agreement, shielded her throughout the night. The old woman of 75 had not been so fortunate. The cellar, as a location, appears repeatedly in the testimony from this period. Berlin's apartment buildings were equipped with substantial cellars that had served as air raid shelters during the years of Allied bombing, and these same spaces became the primary refugees of Berlin's civilian population during the battle. They were logical hiding places, and they were also locations that Soviet soldiers knew to check. The dynamics of a cellar full of frightened civilians, mostly women, some children, a handful of old men, were captured with terrible precision in Hiller's diary and in the accounts of other survivors. There was a kind of community that formed in these spaces, born of shared fear and shared experience that cut across the class and political divisions that had separated people before the war. A countess and a cleaning woman found themselves side by side in the darkness, sharing food and information, and, sometimes, grief. The role of German men in this period is a subject that the diaries and memoirs of women address with a complexity and sometimes a bitterness that contemporary readers may find difficult to parse. Where were the German men? The answer is, many of them were dead or in prisoner of war camps, or in the Wehrmacht formations still fighting on the outskirts of the city. But some German men were present in the city during the battle and the occupation, men who were too old or too ill for military service, men who had evaded call-up, a small number of young men still in civilian clothes. These men were largely unable to intervene against Soviet soldiers, and most of them knew it. To attempt to protect a woman from a Soviet soldier in May 1945 was, in most circumstances, to invite immediate death. German men who tried were sometimes shot on the spot. Most did not try, and women who described this period sometimes wrote about the particular quality of the impotence and shame they saw in the faces of the men who stood by while the women were taken. Martha Hillers wrote about this with a directness that is striking even today. She described the German men in the cellar of her building as being in a state of complete paralysis, unable to meet the women's eyes, useless in any practical sense, reduced to the role of helpless bystanders to what was happening to the women around them. She wrote without particular condemnation, recognizing that there was nothing those men could have done that would not have resulted in their own immediate deaths, but also without any attempt to excuse them. The situation was what it was, and the women adapted to it as best they could. The role of other women in this period is equally complex. There are accounts of women who helped hide other women, who diverted soldiers' attention, who created distractions that allowed younger or more vulnerable women to escape. There are also accounts of women who cooperated with Soviet soldiers in ways that placed other women at risk, who provided information about where people were hiding, who in some cases actively assisted in identifying potential victims in exchange for food or protection. These accounts are difficult to judge from a distance of 80 years, and historians are generally careful about imposing moral categories too rigidly on people operating under conditions of extreme duress. What they do suggest is that the experience of Soviet occupation was not simple or homogeneous, and that the same conditions that drove some women to remarkable acts of mutual protection drove others to decisions that, viewed from the outside, look very different. The practical consequences of the mass violence extended far beyond the immediate physical harm, severe as that was. The wave of sexually transmitted diseases that swept through Berlin's female population in May and June of 1945 overwhelmed the already crippled public health system. German hospitals, operating without adequate supplies, without electricity in many cases, without functioning laboratories, attempted to treat women who presented with gonorrhea, syphilis, and other infections. The treatment options available in 1945 before the widespread availability of penicillin in Germany were extremely limited. Many women who contracted syphilis received no effective treatment for months or years, and some suffered lasting physical consequences as a result. The scale of the infection burden was so large that it appears in the historical record as a kind of public health emergency that ran in parallel with the political and military emergency of Germany's occupation and reconstruction. The psychological consequences were, if anything, even more lasting and more difficult to address. The field of trauma psychology was not well developed in 1945, and the specific conditions of wartime were not conducive to any systematic attempt at mental health intervention. Women who had been assaulted were expected to get on with it, to pull themselves together, to focus on the immediate practical challenges of survival in a destroyed city, to feed themselves and their families, to find housing, to locate missing relatives. There was no official acknowledgement of what they had been through, no formal support structure, no therapy, no language even in which their experiences could be publicly discussed. The result was an enormous reservoir of unprocessed trauma that sat beneath the surface of post-war German society for decades, emerging in symptoms that doctors and psychiatrists described but rarely traced to their source, in depression, in anxiety, in the specific difficulty of intimacy that many women who had been assaulted experienced for the rest of their lives. One of the striking features of the testimony from this period is the way women described learning to perform normalcy as a survival mechanism. Hillers wrote about waking up in the morning and going through the motions of normal life, washing, getting dressed, doing whatever small tasks were available, with the mechanical purposefulness of someone who had decided that the alternative to motion was collapse. Many other women described similar strategies. The apartment needed to be cleaned, the remaining food needed to be cooked, the children needed to be fed. These small domestic rhythms became anchors in a period when everything else had given way. They were also, for many women, a way of refusing to be wholly defined by what had happened to them, a form of resistance, quiet and invisible, but real. The children who were present in Berlin during this period occupy a particularly significant place in the historical record and in the national memory of the events of 1945. Children witnessed things that no child should have witnessed. Older children, teenagers, were sometimes themselves victims. Younger children were protected, hidden, shielded by the adults around them to whatever extent was possible. But even those children who were physically spared absorbed the terror and the grief of the period in ways that would shape them for life. A generation of German children grew up in the shadow of events they had experienced but could not understand, surrounded by adults who could not or would not explain what had happened, living in a silence that was itself a kind of wound. In this video, we will find out. So without further ado, let us continue examining the full scope of what occurred. Moving. from the general context to the specific experiences, the specific women, the specific stories that have been preserved, and the long and complicated journey toward historical reckoning that is still, in some respects, incomplete. The story of Käthe Hausmann is one that has been recounted in several German documentary films and historical accounts, though like many of the individual testimonies from this period, it comes to us at several removes, filtered through the recollections of people who knew her rather than through her own direct written account. Hausmann was 41 years old in April 1945, a teacher in the Charlottenburg district of Berlin. She had two teenage daughters, aged 15 and 17. As the Soviet forces approached, she made the decision that many Berlin mothers made. She shaved her daughters' heads, dressed them in boys' clothing, and hid them in a storage room behind a false wall that her husband had built before being called up into the Volkssturm. She herself remained visible, reasoning that her own presence in the apartment might deflect attention from the hiding place. The strategy worked partially. The daughters were not found. Hausmann herself was not so fortunate. She described what happened in the fragments of a letter written to her sister in Hamburg several months later, a letter that was eventually published, with her permission, in a local historical archive collection in the 1980s. She wrote that afterwards she had understood something about human resilience that she had not understood before, that the body has a way of surviving things that the mind cannot quite believe it is living through. The 15-year-old daughter, whose name was Ursula, gave a recorded interview to a German television documentary in 1992 when she was 62 years old. She described the weeks in the hidden room, hearing sounds from the apartment, understanding what was happening, being unable to move or speak or help. She described her mother emerging from the experience, transformed in a way that she, as a teenager, had not had the emotional vocabulary to understand at the time, but that she had spent decades trying to process. Her mother never spoke about it directly, not to her daughters, not to the husband who eventually returned, not in any public forum, but the experience was there in the texture of everything, in the particular quality of her silences, in the way she would sometimes stop in the middle of a sentence and seem to go somewhere else entirely. Ursula said in the 1992 interview that she thought of the women of Berlin in 1945 as having borne a burden that her generation, and the generation after it, owed an enormous debt. A debt of acknowledgement, a debt of witness, a debt of simply knowing what happened and not looking away. The city of Berlin itself bore physical witness to what had occurred. The ruins of the apartment buildings, the rubble-strewn streets, the damaged infrastructure, these were cleaned up and rebuilt in the years and decades that followed. But the human traces of the spring of 1945 were less easily erased. Medical records in the archives, diaries buried in boxes in attics, letters carried in the pockets of old women, the memories embedded in the bodies and minds of the survivors. These things persisted, and they waited, patient as all suppressed truth is patient, for the moment when the world would be ready to hear them. That moment came slowly and imperfectly, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating after the reunification of Germany in 1990. The opening of archives in the former East Germany, the gradual dying off of the political generation that had built its legitimacy on a particular, carefully managed version of the war's history, the emergence of a new generation of German historians who were willing to ask questions that their predecessors had avoided, all of these factors combined to produce, in the 1990s and 2000s, an outpouring of scholarship, memoir, documentary filmmaking, and public discussion that finally began to give German women's experiences of 1945 the attention they deserved. This process was painful, contested, and politically charged. It remains incomplete, but it has been real and it has mattered. Let us now examine the specific Soviet units involved in the battle for Berlin and the occupation that followed, because the story of what happened to German women in 1945 is not a story about a monolithic force acting in a uniform way. The Red Army that entered Berlin was composed of millions of men from an extraordinarily diverse range of backgrounds, nationalities, and experiences. It included Russians from Moscow and Siberia, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Georgians, Armenians, and representatives of dozens of other Soviet nationalities. It included veterans who had fought since 1941 and raw recruits who had barely completed their training. It included professional officers who took military discipline seriously and ideological zealots who viewed every German as an enemy combatant. The behaviour of these different elements was not uniform, and historians have documented significant variations in conduct between different units and different commanders. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's forces, which approached Berlin from the north, had a somewhat better record on average than some other units in terms of the treatment of civilians, a fact that historians have attributed partly to Rokossovsky's personal character and partly to the particular composition and history of his army group. This is a relative statement, not an absolute one, and it should not be taken to mean that Rokossovsky's forces were innocent of violence against civilians. They were not. But the gradient of behavior across different Soviet units was real, and it mattered enormously to the individual women whose fate depended on which unit entered their particular street or apartment building. The units that earned the worst reputations for violence against civilians in Berlin were often those drawn from military formations that had been fighting continuously for years under the most punishing conditions and that had been advancing through German-held territory in Eastern Europe, where the Wehrmacht's conduct had been particularly brutal. Soldiers who had liberated the concentration camps, who had seen the evidence of German mass murder with their own eyes, soldiers who had grown up in villages subsequently destroyed by the German occupation, soldiers who had lost family members to German reprisals or to the deliberate starvation policies that the Wehrmacht had implemented in occupied Soviet territory. These men arrived in Germany carrying a cargo of personal grief and collective rage that was genuinely difficult to contain. The role of alcohol cannot be overstated. Berlin's stocks of wine and spirits, while depleted by wartime rationing, were still substantial enough to supply thousands of soldiers with enough alcohol to completely undermine their judgment and self-control. Soviet soldiers had a culture of heavy drinking that was, if anything, encouraged by the conditions of wartime, where vodka rations were a standard part of military logistics. When those soldiers entered the wine cellars and alcohol stockpiles of Berlin's apartment buildings, restaurants and warehouses, the results were predictable. Witnesses described soldiers who were so heavily intoxicated that they could barely stand, stumbling through darkened corridors, creating noise and chaos that gave women small but precious windows of time to hide or escape. But they also described soldiers whose drunkenness made them more rather than less dangerous, more unpredictable, more violent, more likely to escalate when they encountered resistance or when their initial approach was unsuccessful. One of the most detailed accounts of the role of alcohol in the events of those weeks comes from a German doctor, Dr. Elisabeth Freund, who worked at a women's clinic in the Neukölln district during the occupation, and who preserved her case notes and personal diary from the period. Freund's notes, which were deposited with a Berlin archive in the 1970s and subsequently studied by historians, document case after case of women assaulted by soldiers who were, in the attending doctor's assessment, severely intoxicated. She also documented the medical consequences with a precision born of professional training and a personal horror that she managed to keep out of her clinical notes, but that surfaced in her diary entries. She wrote on the 7th day of the occupation that she had seen more violence concentrated in 1 week than in all her previous years of medical practice combined, and that she did not know how the women she was treating were managing to continue to function, to dress themselves in the morning, to bring their children to the clinic, to stand in her waiting room with faces that looked completely ordinary from a distance and which, up close, showed nothing ordinary at all. It was not only in the city's hospitals and clinics that the scale of the crisis became apparent. The Soviet occupation of Berlin brought with it a restructuring of daily life that had its own complex relationship to violence and survival. As the fighting ended and Soviet authority was established, a new and unfamiliar order imposed itself on the city. Soviet commandants set up offices in each district. Soviet soldiers occupied buildings that had been commandeered as billets. Food distribution was reorganized and placed under Soviet control. Women who needed food rations, medicine, or any form of official documentation quickly discovered that navigating the Soviet bureaucracy required a kind of pragmatic flexibility that many found psychologically difficult to sustain. The Kommandatura, as the Soviet district headquarters were called, became a kind of central node in many women's lives during the occupation. Soviet officers ran these offices, and some women found that they could secure better treatment, or at least less bad treatment, by making themselves useful to the administration in various ways. Some women spoke Russian, either learned before the war or picked up during the occupation itself, and this became a valuable and sometimes dangerous asset. Women who could translate became important intermediaries between the Soviet administration and the German civilian population, and this role gave them a degree of influence that could be used for protection, for themselves and sometimes for others. but it also brought them into close contact with Soviet officers in ways that carried their own risks and complications. The story of Ilse Naumann, preserved in a collection of Berlin women's testimonies compiled by a German women's history project in the 1990s, illustrates some of these complexities. Naumann was 38 in 1945, a former schoolteacher who had studied Russian at university before the war, and who had been dismissed from her teaching position in 1937 for being married to a man who was, according to the Nazi classification system, half Jewish. Her husband had been killed in 1943 in circumstances she described as deliberately obscure, which suggests he may have been a victim of the Nazi persecution that intensified as the war turned against Germany. When the Soviet forces arrived, Naumann found herself in a position that was genuinely paradoxical. Her language skills made her useful to the Soviet administration. Her history as someone who had been persecuted under the Nazi regime gave her a degree of moral authority in the eyes of some Soviet officers. And yet she was still a German woman in occupied Berlin, still subject to the same threats and vulnerabilities that faced every other German woman in the city. Naumann described in her testimony a meeting with a Soviet colonel in the first week of May 1945 that she said changed her understanding of what was happening. The colonel, she said, was a man in his 40s, educated, someone who in normal circumstances she would have described as civilized and even humane. He spoke to her courteously, in reasonable German. He expressed with what seemed like genuine regret that he could not fully control what his soldiers were doing. He described the problem, in his framing, as one of exhaustion and breakdown of discipline after years of total war. He seemed to feel that this was a tragedy, but a more or less inevitable one, something to be survived rather than prevented. Naumann wrote that she had wanted to scream at him that it was not inevitable, that it was a choice, that each soldier who committed an assault was making a choice, and that the command structure that was choosing not to enforce discipline was also making a choice. She did not scream. She needed his cooperation for practical reasons. She swallowed everything she wanted to say and focused on the immediate task of getting the food distribution to the district's civilians restarted. This kind of constrained, pragmatic interaction, in which women manage their own rage and grief and terror in order to accomplish immediate practical goals, was a pattern repeated thousands of times across the city in those weeks. It was another form of the survival calculus that Hillers described in her diary, a constant weighing of the possible against the acceptable, a constant performance of normalcy and cooperation in situations where nothing was normal and cooperation was purchased at an enormous internal cost. The women who did it were not passive. They were not collaborators. They were people doing what they had to do in order to live, and in order to secure whatever degree of safety they could for the children and elderly relatives in their care. The children of Berlin were, in many respects, the most vulnerable group during the occupation and the most deeply affected by what they witnessed. German children in 1945 ranged in age from infants to teenagers, and their experiences of the Soviet occupation varied enormously depending on their age, their family situation, their location, and luck. Very young children were largely oblivious to the specific nature of what was happening around them, though they absorbed the terror and the disruption of normal life in ways that would emerge later in their development. Older children, from roughly 10 upward, understood more, and in some cases understood far too much. The testimony of survivors who were children in 1945 is among the most emotionally charged material in the historical record. These individuals, many of them now in their 80s or 90s, describe the particular quality of the childhood knowledge they carried. The things they saw and heard that no child should see and hear. The years they spent trying to make sense of memories that did not fit into any framework that their subsequent education or social experience provided. One woman, who was 12 years old in Berlin in May 1945 and who gave a lengthy interview to a German documentary filmmaker in 2005, described the moment she realized that the sounds she could hear through the thin walls of the apartment building were not sounds she had a name for, and that the adults around her were not going to give her a name for them, and that this was a silence she would carry for decades before she found, in her 60s, a context in which she could finally begin to speak. The impact of these experiences on the post-war generation, the children of 1945, and the slightly older teenagers who were just old enough to understand and just young enough to have no framework for processing what they understood, has been the subject of increasing scholarly and therapeutic attention in recent years. German psychologists and therapists working with elderly patients in the late 20th and early 21st centuries began noticing patterns in their clients that seemed to cluster around birth years between 1930 and 1940. Patients who had been children in the ruined cities of 1945 and who were presenting decades later with symptoms of untreated trauma. These findings, combined with the broader academic literature on intergenerational trauma transmission, suggested that the events of 1945 had left marks not just on the women who directly experienced the violence, but on the children who witnessed it and, through complex psychological mechanisms, on those children's children as well. The intergenerational dimensions of the story are perhaps the most difficult to discuss and the easiest to oversimplify. It is important to be careful here. The claim that trauma can be transmitted across generations is supported by a substantial body of psychological and even biological research. But the mechanisms are complex and contested, and the relationship between historical events and the mental health of subsequent generations is not simple or direct. What can be said with some confidence is that the silence that surrounded the events of 1945, the silence in families and in society, created conditions in which trauma could not be processed or resolved, and that children who grew up in families shaped by unacknowledged violence and grief were often themselves shaped in ways they did not understand. The daughters and sons of Berlin's women of 1945 grew up with mothers who flinched at certain sounds, who went silent at certain questions, who carried something heavy that they could not name and would not share, and those daughters and sons often passed something of that heaviness on in turn. Now, let us consider the specific experiences of women from different social classes and backgrounds, because the events of 1945 cut across all divisions of class, education, and political history in ways that were simultaneously levelling and revealing. The Countess Marie-Thérèse von Strachwitz, whose testimony was published in a collection of German aristocratic women's memoirs in the 1980s, described the occupation of the family's Berlin townhouse, with a combination of aristocratic composure and barely suppressed fury that is a striking contrast to the more direct and emotional accounts of other survivors. Von Strachwitz had grown up in a world of formality and restraint, and she applied those habits of mind to the experience of 1945, with results that are simultaneously admirable and heartbreaking. She describes Soviet soldiers going through the family silver, removing oil paintings from the walls, sleeping in the family's ancestral beds, in a tone of cool, factual description that conceals more than it reveals. It is only in the final pages of her memoir, describing her first return to the townhouse after the Soviet units moved on, that the composure breaks and something raw and more honest emerges. Working-class women from the industrial districts of Wedding and Moabit, whose testimony was collected by the West Berlin Senate's Historical Documentation Project in the 1970s, describe their experiences in a different register. More direct, less concerned with maintaining a certain kind of social face, more willing to use explicit language about what had happened. These women had fewer resources than their aristocratic counterparts, fewer places to hide, less material that might serve as a distraction or a bargaining chip. They had also, in many cases, less to lose in terms of the social conventions that made it difficult for women of higher status to speak plainly. Their testimony is often blunter and in some ways more useful to historians precisely because it is less filtered through the conventions of genteel narrative. What is striking, across all of these different voices and social positions, is the consistency of the core experience. The terror was the same regardless of class. The strategies for survival were similar, adjusted for the practical resources available. The aftermath, the silence, the difficulty of speaking, the burden of memory, these were not class-specific. They belonged to the whole experience of being a woman in Berlin in May 1945. And this universality is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened, because it underlines the scale and the systematic nature of the violence in a way that no number of statistics can quite capture. The Soviet soldiers who were stationed in Berlin during the occupation, and in the months that followed when the Soviet zone of the city was formally established and administered, were not all perpetrators. Many of them were simply young men doing garrison duty in a foreign city, trying to stay warm, trying to understand where they were, trying to figure out when they might be allowed to go home. Some of them formed genuine relationships with German women and girls, relationships that were never free of the fundamental power imbalance of occupation, but that were, by the testimony of those involved, sometimes characterized by genuine affection. The Soviet officer who brought food to Marta Hillers and her neighbors was not, in her description, a monster. He was a man of some education, some culture, who had found himself in an impossible situation and was navigating it with more humanity than many of his comrades. She did not romanticize this. She was too clear-eyed for that, but she was also too honest to caricature it. The complexity of these human interactions, layered over the much larger and darker reality of the mass violence, is part of what makes the history of Berlin in 1945 so difficult to reduce to simple moral categories. Historians who have studied the period emphasize that both things were simultaneously true, that the mass violence against German women was real, systematic, and criminal, and that the individual encounters between German civilians and Soviet soldiers were diverse, ranging from brutal assault to genuine human kindness and every possible gradation in between. Holding both of these truths at once is not easy, but it is necessary if the history is to be done honestly. By June of 1945, the immediate phase of mass violence had largely, though not entirely, subsided. The formal demarcation of Berlin into 4 occupation zones, American, British, French, and Soviet, created a different administrative reality. The Soviet zone was placed under stricter military discipline, at least nominally. The worst perpetrators were sometimes, though not always, removed from positions where they had regular contact with the civilian population. New Soviet officers arrived to replace those who had been involved in the immediate battle, and some of these newcomers took a different approach to the management of relations with German civilians. The violence did not stop entirely. There were documented cases of assault against German women in the Soviet zone throughout the remainder of 1945 and into 1946. But the acute phase, the worst of it, was concentrated in the weeks of the battle itself and the first month of occupation. What came next for the women who had survived it was the long work of carrying on. Berlin in the summer of 1945 was a city in which the basic infrastructure of daily life had been almost entirely destroyed. Electricity was unavailable for most of the city. Running water was intermittent at best. Food was scarce, distributed through a rationing system controlled first by the Soviet authorities and then, as the Allied occupation zones were established, by separate rationing systems in each zone. Fuel was unavailable. The transport system was destroyed. The economy was non-functional. And yet life continued, because it had to. Women who had survived rape, bombardment, starvation, and the complete collapse of everything they had known found ways to continue. The rubble women, as they became known in German as the Trümmerfrauen, are one of the most iconic images of post-war Germany. They were the women of Berlin and other German cities who, in the months and years after the war, took on the physical work of clearing the rubble of bombed buildings, passing bricks hand to hand in long chains, stacking the usable ones, discarding the broken ones, slowly making the city habitable again. Their image has become something of a symbol of German resilience and rebuilding, and like all such symbols, it simplifies a complex reality. The Trümmerfrauen were real. Their work was real. And many of them were also survivors of what had happened in the spring of 1945, women who had been assaulted, who were still processing trauma, who were carrying pregnancies or recovering from abortions, who had lost husbands and fathers and brothers, who were managing households and children entirely alone, and who were nonetheless out every morning with their bucket brigades clearing the rubble of a city that had destroyed itself. The resilience that image represents is genuine, but it should not obscure the suffering that it was built upon. The question of how Soviet soldiers who had committed serious crimes against German civilians were held accountable, if they were, is one that the historical record answers in a deeply unsatisfying way. The short answer is that the great majority were not. Some were disciplined by Soviet military courts for what were described as excesses, a category that included everything from theft to murder to rape, and some of those disciplinary actions resulted in significant punishments, including execution in the most extreme cases. But the number of Soviet soldiers formally disciplined for violence against German women bears no relationship to the number of incidents that occurred. Researchers who have examined the relevant Soviet military justice records have found a pattern of sporadic, inconsistent enforcement in which punishment depended far more on whether an individual officer chose to report and pursue a case than on any systematic commitment to accountability. Most cases were never reported. Most perpetrators returned home in the years after the war and lived their lives without facing any formal consequences for what they had done in Germany. This impunity is an important part of the story, though it is also a pattern common to wartime sexual violence across many conflicts and many historical periods. The fundamental failure to take violence against women seriously as a crime, the tendency to treat it as an unfortunate but inevitable byproduct of war rather than as a matter for military justice, was not unique to the Soviet army in 1945. It was characteristic of virtually every army in virtually every conflict until relatively recent decades. The developments in international law and military justice that have resulted, in the 21st century, in the prosecution of wartime sexual violence as a crime against humanity are a direct, if belated, response to patterns of impunity that have been documented across centuries of warfare. Berlin in 1945 is one of the most extensively documented examples of that pattern, and it is therefore an important reference point for anyone who wants to understand why those legal developments were necessary. Among the voices that have contributed most to our understanding of the events of 1945 is that of Ingeborg Jacobs, a German journalist and historian who spent years researching and writing about what happened to German women in the East in the final months of the war and the first months of peace. Her book, Freiwild, Fair Game, published in 2008, was the product of research in German, Soviet, and international archives combined with extensive interviews with survivors. Jacobs was particularly attentive to the experiences of women in the territories that had been German before 1945 and became Polish or Soviet after it. The Pomeranian, Silesian, and East Prussian women whose experiences were in some respects even more extreme than those of the Berliners, because they had fled ahead of the Soviet advance, often in winter, often on foot, often losing family members along the way, and then found that flight was not sufficient to escape what was coming. Jacobs documented cases that had not previously been widely known outside of Germany, and some that had barely been known within Germany. She wrote about women who had crossed the frozen Vistula Lagoon on foot in January 1945, fleeing ahead of Soviet forces, a crossing in which thousands died of cold and exhaustion, and who, upon reaching temporary safety in the West, discovered that they had not escaped the violence they were fleeing, only postponed it. She wrote about women in Königsberg, the East Prussian capital, who had survived both the Soviet bombardment of the city and the subsequent occupation, only to find in the years that followed that they were stranded in what was now the Soviet city of Kaliningrad, unable to emigrate, unable to communicate with relatives in the West, unable to speak about their experiences in a political environment that denied those experiences had occurred. Their stories remained buried for decades, emerging only after the Soviet Union's collapse opened archives and made it possible for these women's descendants to begin piecing together what their mothers and grandmothers had endured. The political dimensions of the suppression of this history are important and deserve extended examination. In the Soviet Union, the events of 1945 in Germany were not secret in the sense that nobody knew about them. They were secret in the sense that they could not be discussed, recorded, or acknowledged. Soviet veterans knew what had happened. Soviet political officers knew what had happened. Soviet commanders, up to and including the highest levels, knew what had happened. But the official narrative of the Great Patriotic War was one of heroic liberation, of the Red Army as the saviour of Europe from fascism, and this narrative left no room for acknowledging that the liberators had also been perpetrators. The women of Berlin and East Prussia and Silesia were, in the official Soviet memory of the war, simply absent. They did not exist in the story. What happened to them had not officially happened. This suppression had practical consequences that extended beyond the purely historical. Soviet citizens who attempted to document or discuss what their army had done in Germany risked serious consequences. Writers, historians, and journalists who touched on the subject found their work blocked, their careers damaged, their manuscripts confiscated. The Soviet archives that contained relevant documentation were classified at the highest levels and would not be open to researchers until after the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991. Even then, the process of accessing relevant records was slow, bureaucratically cumbersome, and incomplete. Many documents from the relevant period remain classified in Russian archives to this day. The full picture of what Soviet military intelligence knew, what Soviet commanders ordered, what Soviet military courts did, is therefore still not available to historians, and may never be fully available. In the Russian Federation today, the subject remains politically sensitive in ways that reflect the broader tension between the genuine, profound, and entirely legitimate pride that Russians take in their country's role in defeating Nazism, a role that involves sacrifices that are difficult for people from other countries to fully grasp, and the EU obligation that historical honesty imposes to acknowledge what was done in Germany by the army that made those sacrifices. These are not easy tensions to navigate, and it is not surprising that they have not been fully resolved. What is perhaps surprising, or perhaps should not be surprising given the history of all national memories of collective crimes, is how fiercely some voices continue to resist any acknowledgement of what occurred. The banning of Antony Beevor's book in Russia, the denunciations of historians who addressed the subject as anti-Russian propagandists, the insistence that accounts of Soviet soldiers' conduct in Germany are fabrications or exaggerations. These responses are not primarily about the historical evidence, which is abundant and consistent. They are about the politics of national memory and the difficulty of incorporating uncomfortable truths into a story of heroism and sacrifice that is both emotionally important and politically powerful. Let us now turn to some of the specific women whose stories have been preserved in detail, whose experiences illuminate the general patterns that historians have documented, and whose names deserve to be spoken and remembered. These are not famous women. They were not political figures or military commanders. They were ordinary women who found themselves in the path of history in one of its most brutal manifestations, and whose experiences tell us something essential about what it means to be a civilian in a city at war. Hildegard Knef, the German actress who later became internationally famous, was 20 years old in Berlin in 1945. She survived the final battle by a combination of luck and quick thinking, disguising herself in male clothing to reduce her risk of assault. Her memoir, published decades later, contains passages about the spring of 1945 that are carefully restrained by the standards of the time, but which make clear to anyone reading between the lines that she was fully aware of what was happening around her and that she spent weeks in a state of continuous vigilance and fear. Knef would go on to become one of the most celebrated figures in German post-war entertainment, but she rarely discussed 1945 in detail in public forums, and her silence on the subject was, like so many silences of that era, eloquent in itself. Ruth Andreas Friedrich was a Berlin journalist and resistance activist who had spent the war years as part of a small underground network called Uncle Emil, which had sheltered Jewish Germans and others persecuted by the Nazi regime. Andreas Friedrich kept a diary throughout the war, and her account of the spring of 1945 is one of the most valuable documents from the period, partly because she brought to it not only the vivid immediacy of personal experience, but the journalist's habit of recording what she observed with specificity and detail. Her diary, published in German in 1945 as Schauplatz Berlin, Battleground Berlin, and later in English as Berlin Underground, describes the final weeks of the war and the Soviet occupation with an honesty that was unusual for its time. She wrote about the violence against women with a directness that her publisher was, in the immediate post-war climate, willing to allow, perhaps because Andreas Friedrich's resistance credentials gave her a kind of moral authority that made her harder to dismiss. She described the days after the Soviet arrival as among the worst she had witnessed in 12 years of living under a regime that had introduced her to many kinds of darkness. Andreas Friedrich's account is particularly interesting because she was in a position to observe the experiences of women from a variety of social backgrounds and circumstances, and because her own background as someone who had actively resisted Nazism gave her a complex perspective on the politics of the situation. She was not a Nazi. She had spent the war years risking her life to undermine the regime. And yet, the women who were being assaulted by Soviet soldiers around her were, by and large, not Nazis either. They were simply women, caught in the machinery of a war that they had not chosen and that they could not stop. Andreas Friedrich wrote in an entry from the first week of May 1945 that she had spent 4 years waiting for the liberation, and that liberation had arrived, and that it did not look the way she had imagined it would look. The moral complexity of this observation runs through the entire history of Berlin in 1945. The Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany was one of the most important events of the 20th century. Without that victory, or without the massive Soviet contribution to it, the history of the century would have been immeasurably darker. The men and women who fought and died in the Red Army between 1941 and 1945 made a sacrifice of genuinely staggering proportions, and the world owes them a debt that can never be fully repaid. These things are true, and they do not become less true when placed alongside the equally true fact that many of the soldiers who made those sacrifices also committed crimes of the most serious kind against German civilians, particularly women. The heroism and the crime coexisted. The liberation and the violence were simultaneous. History is full of such terrible paradoxes, and this is one of the most difficult and most important. Now let us examine how the experience of 1945 intersected with the longer history of gender and society in Germany, and how the events of that spring both reflected and reshaped the social structures that had governed German women's lives for generations. German women in 1945 lived in a society that had, despite the upheavals of the Weimar Republic and the Nazi period, maintained profoundly patriarchal assumptions about gender roles. Women's primary social function in the dominant ideology of both the traditional conservative right and the Nazi regime was domestic: wife, mother, keeper of hearth and home. The Nazi regime had, with particular fervour, promoted a vision of German womanhood in which women were removed from the public sphere and returned to what the regime insisted was their natural domain. The famous Nazi slogan, Kinder, Kirche, Küche, children, church, kitchen, encapsulated this vision with brutal efficiency. The events of 1945 shattered this vision with an equally brutal efficiency of a completely different kind. The men who were supposed to protect the women of Germany's domestic sphere had failed catastrophically in that role. Not through any fault of their own as individuals, in most cases, but because the regime that had promised them military glory and racial supremacy had instead led Germany into total defeat. The women who were left behind, the millions of women in the bombed-out cities, and the refugee columns and the cellars of Berlin, were on their own. And the way they responded, with pragmatism, with resourcefulness, with a collective intelligence born of shared danger, with the particular kind of strength that emerges when everything else has been stripped away, told a very different story about German womanhood than the one the Nazis had been promoting. The social historian Atina Grossmann, whose research on gender and sexuality in post-war Germany has been enormously influential, has argued that the events of 1945 produced what she calls a fundamental disruption of conventional gender relations, and that this disruption had long-lasting consequences for the way Germans thought about women's roles, about sexuality, and about the relationship between private experience and public history. Grossmann's work is careful and nuanced, and she is attentive to the ways in which this disruption was simultaneously a moment of genuine female agency, of women doing and deciding things that conventional gender roles would never have permitted, and a catastrophe of violence that no amount of subsequent social change can make retrospectively acceptable. She holds these two dimensions of the story together without collapsing one into the other, which is the only intellectually honest way to handle material this complex. The women who emerged from 1945 were different from the women who had entered it. This is a generalization, of course, and generalizations about groups as large and diverse as the female population of a major city always require qualification. But the specific, documented experiences of thousands of women in Berlin suggest that the spring of 1945 produced what might be described as an accelerated maturity, a kind of stripping away of illusions about the nature of male authority and protection, about the relationship between strength and vulnerability, and about the social structures that had governed their lives before the war. Women who had endured what they endured and managed to survive it had in many cases learned things about themselves and about human nature that could not be unlearned. And that made certain kinds of conventional social performance increasingly difficult to sustain. This did not translate, in most cases, into any kind of feminist awakening in the political sense of that phrase. The women of Berlin in 1945 were not, by and large, interested in political theory. They were interested in food, in shelter, in finding their children and their missing relatives, in making it through the next day and the day after that. But the practical experience of managing without men, of making decisions under conditions of extreme pressure, of navigating the Soviet occupation with nothing but their own wits and their collective intelligence, left many of them permanently changed in ways that sometimes surprised them when they looked back on it decades later. Several women interviewed by researchers in the 1980s and 1990s described the period after the war. The years when they were managing their households and their families entirely alone, while their husbands were still in prisoner of war camps, as the most challenging and also in some ways the most vivid and purposeful time of their lives. This is not a romantic observation. It is simply an honest one. The question of how German women in the post-war period dealt with, or failed to deal with, the returning men is one that the historical record addresses with some care. The return of German soldiers and prisoners of war was a prolonged process that took years. Some men came back in the immediate post-war period. Others remained in prisoner of war camps, particularly Soviet camps, for much longer. The last German prisoners of war were not released from Soviet camps until 1955, a full decade after the war's end. The men who came home early often came home to find women who had changed in ways they did not expect and could not easily accommodate. Women who had been making decisions and managing households and surviving catastrophes on their own for years, and who were not necessarily prepared to simply step back into the subordinate role that pre-war gender conventions prescribed. The marriages that were strained or destroyed by this dynamic are difficult to quantify, but accounts from social workers, clergy, and medical practitioners who worked with German families in the late 1940s and early 1950s consistently describe a pattern of adjustment difficulties, of men who felt displaced and emasculated by the independence their wives had developed, and of women who had lost the habit of deference and were not sure they wanted to reacquire it. These tensions were complicated, in many cases, by the additional layer of unspoken experience, the things the women had been through that they could not tell their husbands, that they feared their husbands could not bear to hear, or that they knew their husbands would use to hurt them. The silence that covered the events of 1945 was not only a social and political silence, it was a silence within families, within marriages, within the most intimate relationships of daily life, and it created distances that in many cases never closed. Among the most poignant accounts in the historical literature are those of women who did try to tell their husbands what had happened, and who encountered responses that ranged from the compassionate to the devastating. One woman, whose testimony was published in a German women's history journal in the early 1990s under a pseudonym, described telling her husband when he returned from a Soviet camp in 1947, 2 years after the end of the war. She had spent 2 years carrying the experience alone, and she told him because she felt that a marriage built on concealment was not a marriage she could sustain. Her husband listened without interruption. When she finished, he left the room and did not return for 3 days. When he came back, he told her that he loved her and that they would never speak of it again. They were married for another 40 years. She said that the agreement to never speak of it was both the most generous and the most painful thing he had ever done for her. Generous because he chose to stay, painful because the silence meant she was still, in some sense, alone with it. Another woman, whose testimony is part of the same collection, described a very different reaction. Her husband, who returned in 1946, heard what she told him and concluded that she was, in his word, ruined. He left within the week. She raised their 3 children alone. When she was in her 70s and was interviewed for a documentary, she said that she had spent decades being angry at him and that she had eventually arrived at something that was not quite forgiveness, but was perhaps a kind of understanding. A recognition that the young man who had left her had been incapable of the emotional maturity the situation required, that he had been destroyed by the war in his own way, just not a way that anyone officially acknowledged. She said this without bitterness, or without the bitterness that had once been the dominant note. What she felt, she said, was mostly sadness, for both of them, for the life they might have had if either of them had been different, or if the world had been. The medical establishment's response to the events of 1945 was, by the standards of the time, both more and less adequate than one might hope. German doctors and nurses were themselves traumatized, exhausted, and operating under impossible conditions in the months following Berlin's fall. They were treating not only the victims of sexual violence, but the casualties of the battle itself, the wounded soldiers and civilians, the people who had been bombed and burned and starved. The medical infrastructure of the city was in ruins. Many hospitals had been destroyed or badly damaged, others had been commandeered by Soviet forces. The remaining facilities were overwhelmed, short of every supply, working without electricity in many cases, and staffed by medical professionals who were themselves living through the same conditions as their patients. In this context, the response to the victims of sexual violence was inevitably piecemeal and inadequate. Physical injuries were treated to whatever extent supplies allowed. The treatment of sexually transmitted infections was hampered by the shortage of effective medication. Therapeutic support, in the modern sense, was essentially non-existent. Women who came to hospitals or clinics were treated as much as possible with clinical efficiency, and then sent back out to manage as best they could. There was no follow-up. There was no referral to psychological services, partly because those services did not exist in any systematic way, and partly because the conceptual framework for understanding trauma as a medical condition requiring treatment did not yet exist in the form we now take for granted. The women who were treated and sent home were left to do alone the internal work of making sense of what had happened to them, and to do it in a social context that was not going to help them. Some women found support in religious institutions. The churches of Berlin, both Catholic and Protestant, remained functioning to a degree that few other institutions did in the immediate post-war period, and they provided, in many cases, the only organised social support available. Clergy who heard confessions and conducted pastoral visits in those weeks were among the earliest outside observers to grasp the full scale of what women had experienced, and some of them played important roles in providing whatever comfort and practical assistance they could. The documents that survive from church archives in Berlin contain some of the earliest systematic accounts of what women described to their pastors and priests in the summer and autumn of 1945. These accounts are, for the most part, not available in published form. Church archives are generally not open to researchers in the same way that civil archives are, and individual confessional records are in any case protected by the most stringent confidentiality. But clergy who wrote about what they witnessed in their own memoirs and correspondence, using appropriately anonymous language, contributed to a body of documentation that historians have been able to draw on. The picture that emerges from these sources is consistent with the picture from medical records, from diaries, and from survivor testimony. The scale of what happened was immense, the suffering was real and severe, and the social resources available to address it were entirely inadequate. The role of religion in the women's own responses to their experiences is complex. Some women found genuine comfort and support in their faith, finding in religious frameworks a way of making sense of suffering that secular frameworks did not provide. Others found that what had happened to them made faith impossible, that the God they had believed in before seemed to have been absent from Berlin in May 1945 in a way that they could not forgive or explain. Still others had a more pragmatic relationship with religion, attending services and receiving pastoral care because these were among the social services available, without necessarily deriving spiritual comfort from them. The spectrum of religious response, like the spectrum of personal response more generally, was as wide as the number of women involved, which is to say enormously wide. The Allied authorities who arrived in Berlin in the summer of 1945 to administer the British, American, and French occupation zones found a situation that was deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge. The Soviet Allies were nominally partners in the occupation, and the relationship between the Western powers and the Soviet Union, already strained by ideological differences and by the emerging dynamics of the Cold War, was too politically important to be destabilized by public acknowledgement of what Soviet forces had done to German civilians. American and British military officers who wrote reports about conditions in the Soviet zone did, in many cases, include information about sexual violence in their official assessments, and these reports are among the documentary sources that historians have since drawn on. But this information was largely kept internal and was not made the subject of public statements or diplomatic protests. The reasons for this diplomatic reticence were not simply cynical, though cynicism was certainly present. The Western Allies were also aware that their own forces had not been entirely free of violence against German civilians, particularly in France and Belgium in the immediate aftermath of the D-Day landings, and that raising the conduct of Soviet forces before a public or diplomatic forum would invite uncomfortable scrutiny of their own record. The scale of Soviet violence was considerably larger, and the manner in which it occurred had a systematic quality that was distinctive, but the principle of not throwing stones in glass houses was not without some application. The result was a diplomatic silence that allowed the subject to remain officially unaddressed in the immediate post-war period. The women of Berlin in this context found themselves doubly abandoned. First, by the failure of their own military and government to protect them, and then by the failure of the international community to acknowledge what had happened, let alone to provide any mechanism of accountability or justice. This double abandonment is an important part of the story, and an important reason why the silence lasted as long as it did. Women who might have been willing to speak faced not only personal social stigma, but the knowledge that there was no official structure ready to hear them, no legal framework that would take their accounts seriously, no political will to address what had occurred. This began to change, slowly and incompletely, from the 1980s onward. The development of feminist historiography, and in particular the emergence of women's history as a serious academic discipline, created both the intellectual framework and the practical research infrastructure that allowed scholars to begin addressing the events of 1945 systematically. Oral history projects, which collected the testimony of elderly women who had lived through the period, became an important source. Archival research in German, Polish, and Russian repositories yielded documentary evidence that supplemented and contextualized the personal accounts. The combination of personal testimony and archival documentation, brought together by historians who were asking questions that previous generations had not asked, produced a picture that, by the early 2000s, was substantial enough to demand attention. The publication of Antony Beevor's Berlin: The Downfall, 1945 in 2002 was a turning point in terms of public awareness. Beevor was a military historian with a large popular following, and his book, which dealt with the Battle of Berlin in comprehensive detail, devoted significant attention to the violence against German women. His use of Soviet military records that had been classified until after the Cold War gave his account a documentary authority that was difficult to dismiss. The book became a bestseller in multiple countries and introduced the subject to a global readership that had had, in many cases, no previous awareness of it. The reaction in Russia, where the book was briefly imported before being banned, illustrated how raw the subject remained, 60 years after the events it described. In Germany, the public response to Beevor's book and to the simultaneous German-language publication of Martha Hiller's diary was one of genuine shock for many readers, combined with a recognition among older Germans of something they had known but had not seen, named and documented in this way before. The German debates that followed were themselves revealing. Debates about how to fit the suffering of German women in 1945 into a national historical narrative that was primarily organized around German guilt for the Holocaust and for the war. Debates about whether acknowledging German suffering in any way relativized German crimes. Debates about whether the women of 1945 deserved the same kind of memorial attention that had been given to other groups of victims. These debates were heated and unresolved, as such debates tend to be, and they continue in various forms to this day. The Heldenfriedhöfe, the memorial sites and museums of Germany, have grappled with the question of how to represent the experiences of German women in 1945 within broader narratives of the war and its consequences. The German government has, in recent years, provided funding for research and documentation projects dealing with the subject, an acknowledgement that this history deserves official attention and resources. Some German states have included the experiences of 1945 in school curricula, though with significant variation in how the subject is addressed and how much space is given to the complexity and sensitivity of the material. The memorial landscape of Berlin has expanded to include some recognition of the experiences of the city's women during the Soviet occupation, though this remains less prominent and less developed than the memorialization of other aspects of the war and its consequences. The Soviet Memorial in Treptower Park, one of the most imposing war memorials in Europe, stands in the former Soviet zone of Berlin as a monument to the Soviet soldiers who died defeating Nazism. It is genuinely impressive, and the sacrifice it commemorates was genuinely enormous. Standing before it, it is possible to hold in mind simultaneously the heroism it represents and the violence that some of those same soldiers committed, and to recognize that both are part of the history, that a complete account requires both truths and that the scale of the memorial does not and cannot erase the experiences of the women whose stories are not represented there. The women of Berlin in 1945 have no comparable memorial. They have no equivalent monument, no central physical space where their experiences are acknowledged and their suffering marked. What they have, increasingly, are the books and the research and the documentary films and the public discussions that have accumulated over the past 30 years, an unofficial memorial built of words and images and the testimonies of those who survived and those who came after them. It is not nothing. But it is not enough either, and the gap between what these women endured and the official recognition they have received remains a measure of the distance that historical reckoning still needs to travel. The question of what justice would look like for the women of Berlin in 1945 is one that admits no satisfying answer. The perpetrators are long dead, the witnesses are old, and many of them are also gone. The political and institutional systems that might have provided accountability in the immediate aftermath have long since been dissolved or transformed beyond recognition. What remains possible is the justice of acknowledgement, of honest historical attention, of a refusal to accept that what happened to these women was inevitable, acceptable, or too complex or too politically sensitive to be discussed. This kind of justice is available. It requires only honesty and the will to face an uncomfortable truth. That truth is this. In the spring and summer of 1945, German women were subjected to mass sexual violence on a scale that constituted one of the largest such crimes in European history. The perpetrators were primarily Soviet soldiers, though not Soviet soldiers alone. The violence was facilitated by the collapse of military discipline, by alcohol, by the deliberate cultivation of rage among some commanders, by years of accumulated fury at the crimes Germany had committed in the Soviet Union, and by the fundamental failure of every level of the Soviet military command to take seriously its responsibility to protect civilians. The women who were victimized bore no responsibility for what happened to them. They were, in the vast majority of cases, ordinary civilians who had survived years of war and who expected, not unreasonably, that the arrival of the forces that would end the war would bring some degree of safety. It did not. And the silence that covered their experiences for decades imposed by politics and shame, and the inadequacy of the social frameworks available to process what had occurred, was an additional injustice layered on top of the original one. Now, let us turn to the specific matter of how individual women coped in the months and years after the immediate crisis had passed, because the survival of the crisis was only the beginning of a much longer journey. The women who came through 1945 did not enter a world that was equipped to help them. They entered a world that was itself damaged almost beyond recognition, a world in which everyone was struggling with some form of loss or trauma, a world that would, for many years, prioritize economic reconstruction and political stabilization over the less visible and less measurable work of psychological and social healing. The memoirs and interviews that document women's experiences in the months after the battle describe a remarkable range of individual responses. Some women threw themselves into the work of physical reconstruction, into the Trümmerfrau brigades, into the rebuilding of schools and hospitals, into the practical tasks of making the city functional again, as a way of externalizing and managing their internal experience. Others withdrew, becoming quieter, more contained, less available to the people around them, developing over time what would now be recognized as the symptom profile of post-traumatic stress: hypervigilance, avoidance of reminders, difficulty sleeping, emotional numbing, sudden intrusive memories. Some women drank. Some developed somatic symptoms, physical manifestations of psychological distress that the doctors of the period treated as physical complaints without recognizing their psychological roots. The women who found ways to discuss their experiences, even if only with one or two trusted friends or family members, generally fared better over time than those who maintained absolute silence. This finding, which emerges from the retrospective accounts of survivors and from the research of psychologists who studied elderly survivors in the late 20th century, is consistent with what trauma psychology now understands about the relationship between social support and recovery. The women who had access to some form of human connection, some relationship in which the forbidden topic could be approached if not spoken of directly, had some resource that those who were completely isolated did not have. But access to that kind of connection depended on circumstances that varied enormously, on family structure, on the specific relationships available, on luck, and on individual temperament. The most isolated were often those who had lost the most, women whose husbands had been killed, whose families had been scattered by the war, who had come to Berlin from other cities or other countries, and who had no local social network to fall back on. Refugee women from the East who had fled ahead of the Soviet advance and who arrived in Berlin having already lost their homes, their communities, and in many cases their families, found themselves in a city that had its own overwhelming problems and that was not well positioned to absorb and support additional traumatized newcomers. Some of these women settled in Berlin and built lives there. Others moved westward into the British and American zones and eventually into West Germany, following the drift of German refugees and expellees that would, over the following years, relocate many millions of people across the new political geography of divided Germany. Among the refugee women from the East whose experiences have been documented with particular care are those from the cities and towns of East Prussia. East Prussia, Germany's easternmost province, had been the first German territory reached by the Red Army in its westward advance, and the violence that occurred there in the winter of 1944 to 1945 was in some respects a preview of what would later occur in Berlin, played out in a setting that was more rural, more isolated, and in some ways more extreme. The East Prussian city of Königsberg, which was besieged, bombarded, and finally captured in April 1945, produced accounts of the occupation that are among the most harrowing in the entire literature of wartime civilian experience. A woman named Lotta Giese, who was 24 years old in the spring of 1945 and who lived in a small town near Königsberg, gave an account of the Soviet capture of her town that was recorded by a German women's history project in the 1990s, when she was in her early 70s. Giese had stayed behind when her parents and siblings had fled westward in February 1945, unwilling or unable to leave her home and believing perhaps that it would not be as bad as people were saying. When the Soviet forces arrived in mid-April 1945, she found out very quickly that it was as bad as people were saying, and in some respects, worse. She spent the following weeks living in the cellar of her house, emerging only when necessary. By the time the immediate period of violence had passed, she was physically ill, psychologically shattered, and completely alone. She spent 2 more years in what was now Soviet territory before managing to obtain documents that allowed her to leave, arriving in West Germany in 1947 with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and a small notebook in which she had recorded, in abbreviated form, what she had experienced. She kept the notebook for the rest of her life. She showed it to no one until she was in her 60s. The pattern of delayed disclosure, of carrying an experience in private for decades before finding a way or a reason to share it, is one of the most consistent features of the testimony from survivors of the events of 1945. Psychologists who have studied this phenomenon note that delayed disclosure is extremely common among survivors of sexual violence under any circumstances, and that the specific conditions of post-war Germany, with its political imperatives of silence and its social structures of shame, made the delays particularly long. Women who were 20 in 1945 were often 60 or 70 before they found a context in which they could speak, and by then, the urgency was mixed with the knowledge that their time to speak was limited, that if they did not speak now, they never would, that the history they carried would die with them. This urgency is present in many of the interview transcripts from the 1980s and 1990s. A sense among the elderly women who agreed to be interviewed that they were doing something important and perhaps overdue, that they owed it to the women who had not survived, or who had survived but would not speak, to provide some kind of witness. The language of witness, of testimony, of saying what happened so that it is not lost, recurs throughout these accounts in ways that echo the language used by survivors of other extreme historical experiences. These women understood themselves to be bearers of a historical truth that would otherwise be lost, and many of them had lived long enough to understand that the political climate had finally shifted enough to allow that truth to be spoken without the full weight of stigma and accusation that would have descended on anyone who tried to speak it in 1950 or 1960 or even 1970. The documentary filmmaker Helke Sander, whose 1992 film Liberators Take Liberties, in German, Befreier und Befreiter, was one of the first serious cinematic treatments of the subject, described the experience of interviewing elderly women for the film as one of the most powerful of her professional life. Sander, who was herself a significant figure in the West German feminist movement, came to the subject with both scholarly preparation and personal urgency. What she found in hours of interviews with women who had waited decades to speak was a reservoir of testimony that was consistent, coherent, and devastating in its detail. The women she interviewed had not confabulated. They had not exaggerated. In many cases, they had, if anything, understated what they had experienced, because the habits of a lifetime of silence died hard, and because some experiences remained, even after all these years, almost impossible to articulate. Sander's film, and the book of the same name that she co-wrote with Barbara Jaw, provoked significant controversy in Germany when it was released. Some historians questioned her statistical methodology. Some journalists accused her of sensationalism or of serving a political agenda. The controversy was itself revealing. Decades after the events in question, the subject remained sufficiently raw and politically charged that serious scholarly and documentary work could not be received without political arguments breaking out around it. Sander's response to her critics was substantive and largely successful in defending her work's methodological foundations. But the controversy served as a reminder of how difficult it remained, even in 1992, to discuss what had happened to German women in 1945 in any public forum without immediately running into the political minefield that the subject represented. The minefield was not only political, but personal. Some German women who were aware that the subject was being discussed in documentaries, books, and public forums found the process of its becoming public deeply uncomfortable, even those who had not personally experienced the violence. There was a generational dimension to this discomfort. Women who had been children or teenagers in 1945, who had been present in Berlin but had been young enough to be largely shielded from the direct experience, sometimes found the emergence of public discussion disorienting, because it required them to confront, for the first time in a sustained way, what their mothers and older relatives had been through. Some of them had always known, in the way that one knows things in families where certain subjects are never discussed directly, but are present in the atmosphere of every room. Others discovered, from public accounts, that experiences they had suspected but not been able to name had indeed occurred, that their mother's particular kind of silence had been about something specific. The children of the women of 1945, the generation born in the late 1930s and early 1940s, who grew up in the Germany of the late 1940s and 1950s, have become an important voice in recent discussions of the period. These individuals, now in their 80s and 90s, bridge in a particular way the lived experience of the events and the subsequent historical reckoning with them. They were young enough to have survived, old enough to have been shaped by the atmosphere of what surrounded them, and, in many cases, old enough to have eventually learned what their mothers had endured. Their testimony, collected by researchers in the early 21st century, adds an important dimension to the historical record. Not the testimony of the women themselves, but the testimony of those who love them and who have spent their lives living in the shadow of something that was never fully explained. One of the most important contributions to the more recent historical literature on the subject is the work of the German historian Regina Mühlhäuser, whose research on wartime sexual violence has significantly advanced the scholarly understanding of both the events themselves and the ways they have been remembered and forgotten. Mühlhäuser's approach is particularly attentive to the ways in which the experiences of German women in 1945 were embedded in longer histories of wartime sexual violence, histories that include not only what German soldiers had done in the Soviet Union, but what armies throughout history had done to civilian women in the territories they occupied. Her work situates the events of 1945 in a broader comparative framework without losing sight of the specific particularity of Berlin in the spring of that year, and she has contributed to the development of an international scholarly conversation about wartime sexual violence that draws on cases from many different conflicts and historical periods. This international dimension is increasingly important. The events of 1945 in Berlin are not an isolated historical curiosity. They are one data point, albeit an extraordinarily large and well-documented one, in a global history of wartime sexual violence that extends from antiquity to the present. The systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon or tool of war has been documented in conflicts in the Balkans, in Rwanda, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Syria, and in many other settings. International law, through the development of the Rome Statute and the establishment of the International Criminal Court, has responded to these patterns with a framework that treats wartime sexual violence as a crime against humanity and makes it prosecutable at the international level. This legal development owes a great deal to the historical scholarship and advocacy that drew on cases like Berlin in 1945. Cases that demonstrated with overwhelming clarity that sexual violence in war was not an inevitable, natural phenomenon, but a preventable crime that required and was capable of receiving accountability. The women of Berlin in 1945 could not benefit from this framework. It came too late for them. But the documentation of their experiences contributed, through the slow accumulation of historical scholarship over decades, to the intellectual and political case for the legal protections that now exist, imperfect and often inadequately enforced as those protections still are. In this indirect way, the women of 1945 made a contribution to the history of human rights that extended far beyond their individual experiences and far beyond the specific context of their suffering. How should we remember them? This is the question that the history ultimately forces us to ask, and it is a question without a single answer. We can remember them as victims, which they were. We can remember them as survivors, which many of them were. We can remember them as witnesses to a catastrophic failure of military discipline, of international accountability, and of the basic human obligation to protect civilians from violence, which they undeniably were. We can remember them as women who managed to continue living in the aftermath of experiences that would have defeated many people, as women who raised children and cleared rubble and rebuilt a city, and, in the long run, built something worth building out of the wreckage. We can remember them, perhaps most importantly, as individuals, as women with names and faces and particular histories and particular ways of being in the world, women who were not defined by what was done to them, even though what was done to them was real and terrible and cannot be diminished. The particular women whose names appear in the historical record, Martha Hillers, who wrote with such clear-eyed precision about her own experience and that of the women around her, Ruth Andreas Friedrich, who documented what she witnessed with the rigor of a journalist and the passion of a resistance fighter, Lotta Giese, who kept her notebook for decades before she could bear to share it, Ursula Hausmann, who carried the memory of her mother's transformed face across the whole of her adult life. These women, and the many thousands of others whose names we do not know and may never know, deserve to be known as fully as the surviving record allows. They deserve the respect of honest attention and the acknowledgement that their suffering was real and their survival was remarkable. In the Soviet Union, there were soldiers who knew what was happening and were disturbed by it. There are accounts preserved in the memoirs of Soviet veterans and in the interviews of Russian historians who worked with those veterans in the years before their deaths, of men who tried to intervene, who protected individual women, who felt genuine shame at what their comrades were doing. These men were a minority. Their interventions were limited in scope and uncertain in outcome, but they existed, and their existence is part of the complete picture. The behaviour of the Red Army in 1945 was not a monolith. It encompassed extraordinary courage and extraordinary cruelty, generosity and brutality, the deepest compassion and the worst kind of violence, sometimes in the same person, sometimes on the same day. This is not a comfortable fact, but it is a true one. The Soviet veterans who, in later life, spoke with German historians or journalists about what they had witnessed in 1945 often did so with a combination of shame and defensiveness that is psychologically familiar. The shame was real and often genuine. The defensiveness was also real, rooted in the knowledge that their country had made enormous sacrifices and that acknowledging these crimes risked having those sacrifices dismissed or minimized by those who found the crimes convenient for political purposes. What many of these men seemed to want, in their later years, was for it to be possible to hold both truths simultaneously. That what was done was wrong, and that what was also done, the fighting and the dying, and the eventual victory over Nazism, was necessary and important. This is not an unreasonable desire, but it requires an honesty about both sides that was, for most of the post-war period, politically unavailable. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the subsequent dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 opened new possibilities for this kind of honest engagement with the history of 1945. Russian historians gained access to previously classified archives. German researchers could finally work in what had been East German repositories, including files that the GDR's secret police, the Stasi, had kept on various aspects of the post-war period. Joint German-Russian historical research projects became possible, producing scholarship that drew on sources from both sides and that was, in many cases, more nuanced and more complete than what either national tradition had produced in isolation. The political will for this kind of joint historical work has fluctuated with the broader state of German-Russian relations, and the deterioration of those relations that occurred in the second decade of the 21st century created new obstacles. But the scholarly work that was accomplished in the years of relative openness remains available and has permanently changed the state of historical knowledge about 1945. Among the most significant archival discoveries of the post-Cold War period were the records kept by Soviet military medical services, which documented the scale of sexually transmitted disease treatment in the Red Army in the months following the Berlin campaign. These records, while not directly documenting crimes committed against German women, provided indirect but powerful corroborating evidence of the scale of sexual activity, much of it necessarily involving German women, given the conditions and context in the Soviet forces in Germany in the summer of 1945. The numbers in these records were striking to researchers, and they helped to corroborate the high estimates of the scale of assault that had previously been based primarily on German sources and survivor testimony. Soviet intelligence files from the same period also contained reports from Soviet political officers stationed in Germany, who described, with varying degrees of directness and concern, the behavior of Soviet troops toward German civilians. These reports were written for internal consumption and were not intended to be seen by anyone outside the Soviet security and military apparatus, and they therefore have a candor that official public communications from the same period lack. Some of these reports describe the violence with evident alarm, reflecting the concern of political officers who understood, from a practical military government perspective, if not from a moral one, that the behavior of Soviet troops was creating problems for the management of the occupation and for Soviet political objectives in Germany. Others are more detached, treating the situation as a minor disorder to be managed rather than a serious crime to be addressed. Taken together, they add an important dimension to the picture. Evidence from within the Soviet system that acknowledges what was happening in a way that official Soviet history never did. The emergence of this material, combined with the growing body of German survivor testimony and the international scholarly literature on wartime sexual violence, has made it increasingly impossible to dismiss or minimize the events of 1945 as minor incidents or Allied propaganda. The evidence is too abundant, too consistent, and too diverse in its origins to be explained away. What remains contested is not the basic factual picture, but the question of how that picture should be understood, how it should be incorporated into national memories of the war, what accountability might look like 60 or 80 years after the fact, and what the history of 1945 teaches us about preventing similar events in the future. On the question of prevention, the historical record of 1945 offers some specific and important lessons. The factors that led to the mass violence against German women were not mysterious or inevitable. They included alcohol, the deliberate tolerance of senior commanders, the absence of serious discipline and accountability, and the cultivation by some authorities of a climate of revenge. These factors are not unique to any particular army or nationality. They are features of military culture that appear repeatedly in the historical record of armed conflict across many centuries and many societies. The lesson of 1945, combined with the lessons of subsequent conflicts in the Balkans, Africa, and Asia, is that wartime sexual violence occurs when commanders choose to permit it or fail to prevent it, and that it can be substantially reduced when commanders choose to enforce discipline and hold perpetrators accountable. This is a lesson that has been partially learned and incorporated into modern military doctrine, but its application remains inconsistent and incomplete, as the evidence from recent conflicts demonstrates. The women of Berlin in 1945 have waited long enough for their stories to be told honestly and fully. They waited through decades of political silence, through the Cold War and its imperatives of ideological conformity, through the particular difficulty of German society in confronting a form of suffering that did not fit neatly into any of the established narrative frameworks of the war. They have waited through the lifetimes of those who experienced it directly, and through the childhoods and adulthoods of those who grew up in the shadow of what their mothers and grandmothers endured. The waiting is not yet fully over. There are still archival questions unanswered, testimonies unrecorded, historical dimensions insufficiently explored. But the direction of travel over the past 30 years has been toward honesty and acknowledgement, and that direction represents progress. The story of what happened to German women in Berlin in 1945 is not a comfortable story. It does not resolve neatly into heroes and villains, into a simple narrative of right and wrong. It is a story of catastrophic violence committed in the context of a just war, of suffering that was real and terrible and is not diminished by the political context in which it occurred, of silence imposed by shame and politics that lasted for decades, and of the slow, incomplete but real work of historical reckoning. It is a story that demands to be told without deflection, without political instrumentalization, without the temptation to use the suffering of these women for purposes other than the honest acknowledgement of what they endured. The women who survived Berlin in 1945 survived something that was intended, in many cases, to break them. It did not break them, or not entirely, or not permanently. They went on. They raised children. They cleared rubble. They rebuilt lives in the wreckage of a city and a society that had been destroyed by a regime they had not chosen, in a violence that they had not provoked. They deserve to be known. They deserve to be remembered. And they deserve the one form of justice that it is still possible to render, the justice of honest historical witness, of refusing to look away from what they experienced, of insisting that their suffering matters and that their survival was remarkable, and that their stories are part of the history of a world that they helped, in ways large and small, to rebuild. What the women of Berlin endured in 1945 stands as one of the most extensively documented instances of mass wartime sexual violence in European history. The scale, the systematic nature, and the decades-long suppression of the record all make it a case study that historians, lawyers, policymakers, and anyone who cares about the prevention of atrocity needs to understand. But it is also, at its core, the sum of individual experiences, each one complete in itself, each one a life that was profoundly and permanently marked by what occurred in the spring of that terrible year. Those lives deserve to be understood, not only as data points in a historical analysis, but as what they actually were, the lives of real women, with real names and real faces and real histories, women who experienced things that no one should experience and who found, somewhere, the strength to continue. The question that animates so much of the scholarship and the public discussion about the events of 1945 is not really historical. The history, in its broad outlines, is now known. The question is moral and political. What do we owe these women? What does the knowledge of what they endured obligate us to do? The answer cannot be that we owe them nothing, that the passage of time has dissolved all obligation, that history is over and the debt has expired. The answer must include, at minimum, the obligation to know what happened, to teach it accurately, to resist the temptation to simplify or politically instrumentalize it, and to draw from it whatever lessons it offers for the prevention of similar violence in the future. That is not enough. It is not anything close to enough. But it is where we must start, and it is the commitment that this video and the growing body of historical work on which it draws is intended to serve. In the end, what we know about Berlin in 1945 is this. Hundreds of thousands of women were subjected to violence of the most intimate and terrible kind. Most of them survived. Most of them carried what they had experienced in silence for decades. Some of them eventually found ways to speak, and what they said when they said it was consistent and coherent and impossible to dismiss. The world was slow to listen, but it is listening now. And the listening matters. The women of Berlin in 1945 are part of the history of the 20th century in a way that cannot be undone and should not be forgotten. Their names, the ones we know and the thousands we do not, their faces in the photographs that survive, their voices in the interviews that were recorded before time ran out, all of this is part of what we carry forward when we carry the history of that terrible year. We carry it because they carried it first. And because the least we can do after everything is to not look away. Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching this video about one of the most difficult and important chapters of the Second World War's aftermath. The story of what German women endured in Berlin in 1945 is one that took far too long to be told fully, and we hope that this video has contributed in some small way to the ongoing process of honest historical reckoning with what occurred. If you found this video informative and thought-provoking, make sure to check out our other videos on the experiences of women in the Second World War, including what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after the war, and the stories of the children of those Nazi leaders as they grappled with the terrible legacy of their parents. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. History is best understood when it is understood completely and honestly. And that is what we will always try to provide. See you in the next one.